Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. As you can see, if you're watching, I am sitting alongside virtually Daniel Gallen, who was called handsome yesterday by James Franklin at the press conference, and Mark Brennan, who we consider handsome every day of our lives here at Lions247. We're recording on a Tuesday. You will hear this show on a Wednesday. I want to encourage you to check out our episode that dropped on Monday. We're into our in-season format now, so you can anticipate that first episode coming out on Monday afternoons, shortly after we get a chance to hear from James Franklin in a press conference setting, do whatever writing we have to do. There was a lot of updates coming out of James Franklin's Monday press conference. We discussed them. Daniel and I did on Monday. We had Tyler Calvaruso, a recruiting expert, on to break down some standout performances from Penn State commits at the running back position. So all that for you waiting if you missed that episode. We're going to keep moving it forward toward kickoff here on our latest show by focusing in on some big picture conversations. Hopefully you've checked out our roundtable series over at Lions247.com. Mark is spearheading that, collected some answers from us on a variety of topics. We're going to bring that to you in a podcast format now, talking about standout Nittany Lions, breakout players, and potentially tricky games on this schedule. We're also going to give you our season predictions on the final record through 12 games for the Nittany Lions. Later on this week, we'll come back to you with some focus on the Nevada matchup, give you our specific game predictions. We're also going to have a reporter who covers the Wolfpack down there in the Southwest join us for a conversation, taking a look at the first game opponent. But guys, good to have you back on board, and ready or not, that clock is ticking loudly now. Daniel and I spent a lot of time chatting yesterday, so I want to bring you in first, Mark. Just about as much information as we've ever gotten out of a James Franklin press conference, and that was a great way to kick off things for a busy week here in Happy Valley.
Yeah, I feel like Peter Brady in this new format. But it's interesting because James Franklin typically has all those notes up there. And he has the depth chart. And yesterday was like the first time I think he actually was going through and telling us who was where. So Penn State doesn't reveal its depth chart anymore. We will have our prediction at a depth chart later this week, but very informative, as informative as one of those has been in a long time at this point of the season.
Daniel, I also just want to kind of tease some other things we got cooking at Lions247.com. We're going to have our weekly What We're Hearing story thread, I should say, up over at Lions247.com. We're going to give you all the notes and quotes from the conversations we're having with Penn State coaches and players. We invite you to join that conversation. All VIP subscribers can do that. 50% off right now gets your foot in the door. Good time to take a look at how we operate on a game-by-game basis here. But, Daniel, before we jump into some of the big-picture stuff, we had Zane Durant on a call earlier today. I'll mention a little bit of what we heard from Nick Dawkins, but anything worth sharing just to kind of tease behind the scenes the amount of coverage we have going on at Lions247.com.
Yeah, we had a really, I think, insightful conversation with Zane Durant. Sometimes you never know what you're going to get on these Zooms with the players, especially when they're calling in from the phone. But Durant was great. I think he gave us some insight on younger players like Randy Adarica and Owen Wafel. He talked about the overall depth at defensive tackle, how Anai White is doing with that switch over at that position. And then I think the most interesting nuggets that we got from him were about TJ Shanahan, who got mentioned by James Franklin on Monday as one of those 7 offensive linemen. I think that he's someone that you'll see rotate in over the course of a game. But before he went to high school in Texas and became a Texas A&M signee, TJ Shanahan lived in the Orlando area and trained with Zane Durant. So Durant was giving us kind of the lowdown, the scouting report, a little bit of insight into the type of player TJ Shanahan is, which is interesting because we haven't seen him play a real game in a Penn State uniform yet. He's someone that really the only extensive exposure we've gotten to him was, I think, the blue-white game, and there's a million things going on in the blue-white game. So I thought that was really interesting, really informative, and just kind of those are the types of things that you can get in that thread on Lions247.
Yeah, a little while later on Tuesday morning, we had Nick Dawkins. Always a pleasure. I encouraged Penn State's communications department this morning to make him a weekly staple, and Nick said he's up for it. So we'd love to have Tuesdays with Nick all season long if we could. But some really strong commentary on him as a 2-time team captain about where this team's mentality is. And there's been a lot of strong praise for Penn State from an athletic standpoint, the roster attention. But I think what we pick up here locally is just very much a different mindset about this group, the way they're carrying themselves. Dawkins said, quote, "It is no longer the idea of proving other people wrong. It is the idea of proving ourselves right." He went on to say that he believes this is the most cohesive group in America, this Penn State football team. And he also talked about a lot of individual pieces of the process. Cooper Cousins, TJ Shanahan, who you just referenced, Daniel, lauded his work this offseason. He talked about Zane Durant, what he's doing opposite of him, and some of those younger defensive tackles as well. It's all available to you. And again, join the conversation, follow up with a question after we have these things, whatever you want to chime in with. VIP subscribers get access to it all at Lions247.com, 50% off. Still ongoing. Without further ado, let's jump into our roundtable discussion series that we've published a bunch of these over at Lions247.com since last week. And let's get it going with the most indispensable player on the offensive side of the ball. We didn't go offensive MVP, defensive MVP this year. I like the way Mark kind of approached this with some of his phrasing. And we went with indispensable player on offense. And Mark, you led us off in this category. And it was probably the easiest layup of the series.
No, handsome Daniel Gallen did.
I apologize. Handsome Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I really do like the wording of indispensable as opposed to picking an MVP, because with MVP, that's a lot of projection. I think indispensable, that's a combination of what we know now and also projection, and it's a little bit more like intangible. I think when you talk about the way a team functions. Yeah, so I think the two of the times I had the number one pick, I had really easy layups in here. But for this one, I went with quarterback Drew Aller for the most indispensable player on offense. I think that I'm not going to say it speaks for itself because that's a cop-out, but you start with the quarterback. Everything runs through him. We know that Penn State has a really strong running game, and that's something that they can really ride over the course of the season. But if you don't have that 6'5", 235-pound signal caller back there with that arm strength that can keep defenses honest, use that mobility a little bit, I think that Penn State would be in a little bit of trouble. We know there's a number 2 quarterback battle, going on right now, and you sub in Ethan Grunkemeyer or Jackson Smolik into this offense, it looks drastically different, and I think your comfort level changes, immensely. So quarterback, I mean, it's pretty easy. Like I put it in my write-up, the last couple of CFP winning quarterbacks haven't exactly been world beaters when you talk about Will Howard, JJ McCarthy, Stetson Bennett. But I think for Penn State to get to where it needs to go, it needs to have its QB1 back there.
My initial thought was to look elsewhere in the backfield, Katron Allen, Nick Singleton, that type of conversation. But I ended up going in the trenches and to the guy I just discussed, Nick Dawkins. There's a lot to like about Nick Dawkins. And I think I'll just lead with, he is one of the top tone setters I've been around in sports. Doing this professionally for 15 years or whatever, any other sport, whatever. He is one of the guys that I'd want to be in a foxhole with, whether in the trenches with, whatever you want to call it. And so I think his presence on the field, I know they've got Drew Aller as an increasingly vocal presence, but to me, he is the voice of this offense in a lot of ways. You could call him the voice of this locker room too. But we get so caught up in what he is as a speaker and as a leader and off the field, winning the Warfel Trophy last year for his community service, that I think we can kind of forget how much of a force he has become in the trenches. He's a second-team preseason All-American pick from CBS. He's a guy that consistently got the job done. He brings power and intelligence to the field. And I just think with the intricacies that are kind of involved with Andy Kotelnicki's defense and some of the responsibilities pre-snap for the quarterback, to have this guy's brain and body in front of Drew Aller for the course of this season is pretty indispensable. I'm sure they would feel okay about putting Venga, Ioane, or Cooper Cousins at center if they needed to. Those guys are certainly been practicing snapping, and I don't think you want to get into that situation though, because you like what they have at guard. And I think that's the other kind of the conversation here with Nick Dawkins is you're going to have mixing and matching at least at the right guard spot. You're going to have movement around him, 7 guys called starters on the offensive line. And so I think he's going to be important to be that centerpiece, the guy who directs traffic a bit with this group, make sure if there's any questions in those moments between the whistles that he can answer them directly and get guys on the same page. So considering what Penn State has going on up front, what he's already done on the field, Nick Dawkins was my pick. And Mark, you round us out with this category.
Yeah, Singleton and Catron balance each other out. So I'm going with Venga. I mean, to me, if Dawkins were to get banged up, you could move Venga in there and you have so many options at guard. He's a preseason All-American, has established himself as a leader. We saw him at all sorts of camps and stuff in the offseason. So it's tough when you get to third on this list. But to me, indispensable, I look at Venga. And I might even put him a little bit ahead of Dawkins just because of his positional versatility. Again, you're exactly right. You don't want to lose your starting center, but if knock on wood, he's not hurt. But if he were to get banged up, I think you can move Venga over there. We saw him in spring and in camp. He was always snapping with Aller, working with it. So, there's a comfort level there. So you do not want to lose that guy.
Let's go over to defense. And again, it's most indispensable player that we're looking for. I was the first pick this time, and I went with a senior, Dennis Sutton. I think there's two clear answers that I felt comfortable with right off the top. It was Zane Durant and Dennis Sutton. Again, a lot to like about the defensive line leadership and some of the experience at the top, although they have young pieces all over the place. I ultimately went with Dennis Sutton because I just feel like it's a little bit slippier of a slope at defensive end right now. I'm starting to like what they're working with at defensive tackle down to the fourth, fifth guy. Xavier Gilliam is pushing as kind of a starting presence, just like Alonzo Ford. So it feels like you've got like maybe three starters there. Defensive end, we're still hearing Zariah Fisher's, working along, maybe not where they want him to be physically quite yet already. And then Chaz Coleman's been a great story, but he hasn't played a college game yet. So I leaned Dennis Sutton because of his position group. And let's remember what he did last year. When all eyes were on Abdul Carter during the playoff run and everyone's trying to figure out if he's going to be the number one draft pick, you have this former five-star and Dennis Sutton really elevate his game to the next level. 6 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks across 3 playoff games, not to mention that highlight reel interception against Notre Dame going back in coverage. And I think with Jim Knowles now as the coach of this team, he's talked about it before in some of our media sessions during preseason camp. Dennis Sutton is absolutely someone who would have fit in well on that national championship defense for the Buckeyes. He says this is a guy who can play, anywhere across the country. I think he's going to see some different roles for him within this defensive structure as well. And so Dennis Sutton is my pick because I think the conversation at defensive end could get pretty diverse during the season with some of the young pieces who could rise up, but it's got to really start with Dennis Sutton. He has to be that figure, that presence who's going to intimidate opponents. And that is what makes him such an indispensable piece for me on the edge for Penn State.
Yeah, I was tempted to go linebacker just because there's so many question marks there. But, yesterday Franklin talked about it. They're really going to be going out of a 4-2-5. So to me, that makes it – I don't want to say linebackers aren't as important, but I think Zane Durant is just super important at defensive tackle. You lose Devon, Jay Thomas, Izzard, and Beeman, who was there for half a season. He's really the one guy with a lot of experience who's coming back that about. If you would have told me 3 years ago that he was going to be a captain, not sure I would have believed it. Not anything against Zane, but he just wasn't the most vocal guy. And as you were talking earlier, Tyler, about Zane Durant, Daniel, and in the way that he is able to comfortably discuss different players, you could see how he's emerged as a leader. So now I understand. I get why he's a captain. And then I also, Tyler, I'm going to lean on you a little bit because I wasn't on with Nick Dawkins, but you had a Nick Dawkins story that you shared with us that I would like to pass around. But just as I wrap up Zane Durant, I just think he's that valuable, demands double teams. He's going to make everybody around him better.
Yeah, that story from Dawkins. He was asked this morning, I think it was from Audrey Snyder, about the most impressive thing he's seen from Zane Durant in person. And Nick Dawkins referenced the Orange Bowl. And there's a clip that we actually posted on Lions247 to go with this commentary. He was like, he literally just picked up an offensive lineman and threw him at the quarterback and then finished the play. He said it was evil. He said it's the kind of things that like your uncle would brag about doing on the football field when there was no video evidence of it. He said it's a movie video game type thing, but Zane Durant makes it a reality. And Nick Dawkins has said this before. He said it again on Tuesday morning. He says he gets to go up against college football's best defensive tackle on a daily basis. So you like this Penn State football team with those two team captains, big-time linemen, competing every day and really setting the tone for everybody around them. And a little bit of a tangent there, but Daniel, who is your most indispensable defensive piece?
I think tonight Ennis Sutton and Zane Durant were at the top of my board when doing this exercise. But at number 3, I went with Zachy Wheatley at safety. I think when you talk about the last line of defense, someone that can be an eraser, for your front seven or even your cornerbacks, I think safety is a very important spot there. And we talk about Anthony Poindexter has had these veteran heavy rooms over the past couple of years, like just the names like Brisker, Brown, Ellis, Reed, Winston. Those are all guys who played a ton of football. And there were multiple of them in the backfield at the same time. Now it's Wheatley and there's a drop off. It's all second year guys. Even King Mack, who's a junior, it's his second year at Penn State. And he's played, a decent amount of football over his first 2 years. So I think, to have someone on the back end that you trust, who's experienced, who's seen it all, not to mention has the skill set that Wheatley has as a center fielder, that ball hawk, takeaway king, someone who can be that ball magnet and make things happen. I think that Wheatley is going to be really important this year. I know that Poindexter likes the depth that he has at safety a little bit more than he did last year. That depth chart definitely isn't as top heavy going into 2025, but I think that Wheatley at the top of it is someone that makes you feel a little bit more secure, I think, when you go out there and you talk about, the game being played down the middle.
So for indispensable players, we went with 5 seniors. A couple of them have been around longer than 4 years. And we went with a redshirt junior and Venga Ioane, just reflecting the elder statesmen on this squad, which have, increased the expectations around here. Next topic we're going to get into, and this one's going to be led off by Mark. Darkhorse All-American candidate. It's no secret that Penn State has been, really well represented on these preseason All-American teams. I believe CBS Sports didn't have any team more represented than Penn State in its first and second teams for the preseason All-American squad. But some of those names that haven't been showing up time and time again, we're not going to be talking about Venga Ioane or Zane Durant here, or even Nick Singleton. Who is on the top of your board there, Mark?
I'm going right back to Zachy. I mean, excuse me. I forgot he had 16 tackles against Notre Dame in a big interception. He finished first on the team in solo tackles last year with 58. And we finally started to see, remember a few years ago, it was like every spring and every preseason he was tabbed a turnover king, and it just didn't translate to the field. And last year it started to. He tied for the team lead in interceptions with 3. It had a couple of fumble recoveries. So I think he's the kind of guy as a defensive back who could be a stat stuffer. And when people vote on these All-America teams or pick them, what are they looking for? They're looking for the guys who are racking up tackles. They're looking at guys who are going to have a ton of interceptions, turnovers, big plays. So I look at when you have A.J. Harris, how much does that narrow? You have a shutdown corner and A.J. Harris. How much does that kind of close the window for opposing quarterbacks that they may have to look more in other directions, as I slap my microphone for emphasis. So I think he's going to have plenty of opportunities, and I think people are absolutely sleeping on him. And you kind of get it because you can't say that Penn State guys aren't getting enough publicity in the preseason, but he's one guy that I think people are sleeping on and has an opportunity to rise up to maybe that All-America level.
No Nittany Lion has played more combined game snaps, including special teams, than Zachy Wheatley. But I remember a couple of years ago, this wasn't necessarily in the forecast for him. That 2023 season, he benched early against Indiana. I took a look back there the other day. After that Indiana game, 2 other Big Ten games, he was under 10 snaps. So 3 Big Ten games that season, he's under 10 defensive snaps. Had a big comeback season last year, and now big things are expected. What do you have for us, Daniel? You're next on your Darkhorse All-American.
Yeah, I tried to go as, with someone who isn't on any watch list, wasn't really put out in any public setting, really, like Wheatley was going to Vegas for Big Ten Media Days. I tried to make this difficult on myself a little bit, and I settled on Drew Shelton. I think that you talk about the left tackle for the number 2 team in the country, potential national championship contender, who is going into his 2.5-year starter at this point, and no one is really talking about him. I think that's a really interesting position. And I think that, I think we've done it too. We've definitely talked about those other 4 spots a lot more than left tackle and Drew Shelton over the course of this preseason. So I think that when you talk about someone who is going to be in that very prominent position at left tackle, I've seen his name pop up here and there over the course of the offseason in terms of some of these guys that are grinding the tape, draft evaluators, that they see things that they like out there. And I just think that playing for a high profile team where you're guarding the blind side of a potential number 1 overall pick in Drew Aller, you're going to be playing next to Vanga Ioane, who is going to be one of the, I think, best guards in the country, and you're going to be on one of the best offensive lines in the country. I think that you can get to the point where, Shelton is someone that people know, people are watching a lot more. There's a lot more eyeballs on him. And when you get around to, like what Mark said with Wheatley, and people seeing counting stats, people seeing, those sorts of things when they vote on things, left tackle for, a college football playoff team, potential Big Ten champion, that's a pretty nice box to check in terms of a position where there's not really counting stats. So I think that Shelton has been really solid. I'm really curious what it's going to look like at the end of the year when you get into the pre-draft process for him. But I think that he can establish himself over the course of the year and end up on some of these all Big Ten, maybe All-America team by the end of the season.
I went with a running back here. It's not Nick Singleton, because Nick Singleton keeps showing up on these things. And sometimes you'd think, if you were just, not glued in on Penn State, you'd think that Nick Singleton was far and away Penn State's top running back. And then Kaytron Allen occasionally checks in. If you were kind of reading the national narrative around this team, not everybody lumps these two up like we know they belong together, as they have been since their first year on campus. And I think, look, Nick Singleton has always been the one more in the spotlight. That's what happens when you're the Gatorade National Player of the Year before you get to campus. He's the 5-star from the home state. But both of these guys are pretty low-profile personalities, and they have done a lot with their actions. I think of what Kaytron Allen looked like for much of last season. He wouldn't have been on this kind of a list for me. But then you remember what he did in the postseason. 4 games, 66 offensive touches, 459 yards. That's a 7-yard average and 3 touchdowns. And he really changed the complexion and the ceiling of this offensive attack along the way. Andy Kotelnicki, the offensive coordinator, has told us this offseason that the next step for this rush attack is to become dominant. We've invested a lot of time in the offensive line and what that's going to look like. But I think a really important piece is getting a full season of a fully healthy Kaytron Allen, because I think it's really been interesting to hear time and time again from within Penn State's facilities, going back to last winter, that this has been his first full offseason where he's been able to focus on things, not an injury recover, not working through bumps and bruises. He has been in the lab essentially with Stan Drayton. We've talked a lot about how Stan Drayton can improve some of those improvisational open field moments for Nick Singleton, perhaps. Also been working a lot to craft Kaytron Allen's next step. And so we'll see. It's kind of a race here. Both of these guys could end up number 1 all-time on Penn State's leaderboard for rushing. I think what's going to hurt probably Kaytron Allen in this conversation is, the rush attempts aren't going to be there compared to some other All-American candidates, because he's sharing them with Nick Singleton. And then when you look at the final stat sheet, Singleton's likely to have more of a robust season as a receiver. But if we get something close to what Kaytron Allen looked like last January, last December, he could very well be this team's leading rusher. He could put together a hell of a highlight reel and force people to consider putting both of these guys in the All-American conversation. I don't know how often that has happened. I remember when I was much younger, Ronnie Brown, Cadillac Williams, both were top 10 picks in the NFL draft. Both were discussed as All-American players. We've seen these guys for 3 years. I think we're going to get the best of both in 2025, and I'll lean on Kaytron Allen developing some All-American buzz along the way. That's what we've got for you on the Darkhorse All-American candidates, and segueing now to the highest 2026 NFL draft pick. And Daniel, you again lead us off for one that's going to involve QB1.
Yeah, I alluded to it when talking about who Drew Shelton's going to be blocking for. And I went with Drew Aller as the potential first Nittany Lion off the board next year. I do think there are some interesting options when it comes to Penn State, and I'm sure that guys that Tyler and Mark will talk about. I think it is easy to go with the quarterback just because that's where the positional value is, everything along those lines. But when I thought about it in the context of last year, I think Aller's probably, he's not going before Abdul Carter, and then it would depend on need if he would have gone off the board before Tyler Warren there at number 14. But I do think that with where things stand, if he takes another step forward, shows that development that James Franklin has been talking about, I think that Aller will be the first Nittany Lion off the board in April in Pittsburgh. Draft is going to be in Pennsylvania next year, and it does seem like there will be a heavy Penn State flavor over the course of those 3 days.
Yeah, make it a lot easier for some of these staff members to get over there. I think even though it was up in Green Bay last year, and even though they were in the middle of spring ball, you had at least James Franklin and Deion Barnes on location, correct, for the NFL draft. So, yeah, a little bit more manageable with it in Pittsburgh this time around. And I think Denai Dennis Sutton is another who's going to be pushing for top half of the first round consideration. He's where I landed on here. I'm not sure if I would have gone Aller over DDS or where I would have landed. Right now, I don't necessarily know that either is a slam dunk to be a top 10 pick. But they can certainly get there. I think Drew Aller has the better ability to do it because of how the quarterbacks is valued. But when you look at defense in the NFL at every level, I mean, there are a few guys getting paid as much or getting valued as much as edge rushers. And Denai Dennis Sutton, again, the postseason he's coming off of and playing that alongside Abdul Carter, NFL scouts are working through every single piece of those snaps. You better believe number 33 popped up in NFL offices. Would have been really curious to see where he would have landed in the 2025 NFL draft. I think he is a kind of prospect who can really boost his stock even with the production he's put on the field. He can go out there in a combine setting and put on a bit of a show there. Remember the athleticism, those kind of traits have always popped up. Now he's up to 6'6" and about 270 pounds. We talked about for a while. Sometimes when you stand next to him, it's like he's 6'8", 6'9". He's just this huge mammoth presence. So I think he's a guy that also 32 different defensive coordinators could have a very different take on him, where he belongs in the field. Could he play inside? Could he drop back a bit? I think there's just a lot of versatility he presents. He's got a 5-star pedigree. He had Alabama and Georgia and everybody else chasing him a few years back. And I think that it's going to be a similar crowd around him now that he's going to be an NFL draft prospect next year. Based on the season, I think he'll put together as this team's most indispensable defender. So, Mark, 2 players off the board as far as getting off the draft board earliest next. Where do you land for next spring?
We have put the kiss of death on one Penn State defensive back after another, saying they're going to break the streak of no Penn State DB ever going in the first round of the NFL draft. So I am not going to do that to A.J. Harris. I think we have to dial that all back, and hopefully AJ has his opportunity if he decides to go out next year, or maybe.
Let me call a timeout. Can I read you the headline of a story I wrote today?
No.
Kickoff. Yeah, it says countdown to kickoff, 4 days until Penn State football. It's a picture of AJ Harris, and the headline says focus on a DB with first round NFL draft potential. So I already screwed this one up, man.
You ruined it. Well, I'm not going to go to him. You know, I was thinking about Zane Durant, but then I wonder. There's kind of this knock on him that he's undersized. I don't really buy that, but I wonder if NFL GMs may look at that and maybe prefer guys who are, 320 or something. I wouldn't. So I'm going to go back to Venga. I mean, there were 3 offensive guards in the top 24 picks last year. If Venga decides to come out, I think he has that positional versatility. Daniel covered the NFL, tells me that they typically only carry, 8 offensive linemen on a game day roster. That's a guy that, whether he's starting or not, he can play center. He can play either guard. And at 6'4", 345 pounds or whatever he is, he's athletic enough that in an emergency, you could play him at tackle. So I think he has that positional versatility. I already talked about all the other qualities, big, athletic, smart, has all those things going for him. So when I look at somebody who has an opportunity to be up there behind Aller and DDS, who I would think are going to be the top 2, just because those are positions of high value in the NFL anymore. Guard may not be. A couple of years ago, there were no guards in the first round, I don't think, or maybe only one. But I think he's versatile and big and strong and athletic enough that if he decides to go, he'll get that opportunity. One thing I wrote in, half tongue in cheek, Penn State is at Washington next year. And, that's right next to his hometown. Will that make any difference in his decision? Who knows? Probably not. For Penn State's sake, they would hope that it would to get him back for another year. But I think he's going to be in the draft. I think he's projects, if not a day 1, then at least the day 2 type player, and is going to have a great opportunity.
former Washington Huskies commit, the last addition to that 2022 recruiting class that has really done so much for Penn State. What a late pickup he was from the Pacific Northwest. And you actually just took me back to a conversation I had with Phil Trautwein on the practice field back in the spring. Because if you guys recall, we walked onto the field and Venga was getting reps at right guard for those first few weeks, and whereas he was the starter at left guard last season. And Phil Trautwein was basically like, I'm just trying to get him work because flexibility is the name of the game at the next level. I want him to feel confident, and I want NFL scouts to know that he can play both guard positions and he can play center. So great point on that one regarding Venga Ioane. And let's jump over to our next category, which is the breakout players for Penn State, excluding freshmen. So we're talking about guys who've been around the program a little bit, and redshirt freshmen are on the table here, but I'm going with a sophomore to lead things off, and Luke Reynolds at tight end. I should preface this by saying I think fifth-year senior Khalil Dinkins is going to probably lead this position group in total snaps, in total starts, but I just wonder if the ceiling that Luke Reynolds presents doesn't make him more of a flashy type as we get through the season, and a guy that you just start to hear a little bit more buzz about nationally because of the threat he presents. Tyler Warren told us this spring before he was drafted that Luke Reynolds can be as good as any tight end that's ever played at Penn State. And when you hear that from Tyler Warren after the season that he just had, and also knowing that Tyler Warren has never been someone to really be loud and embellish things about other players or about himself. So I took that with some serious sincerity, and everything we've heard feedback regarding Luke Reynolds this year has been he's taken a step to become a complete tight end. You hear a lot about how intensely passionate he's become as a blocker. And we had a chance to talk to Luke Reynolds on the practice field last week. And he told me, since he stepped foot on campus at, 218 pounds, he knew his ticket to playing time was to prove himself as a blocker. Now, that's a lot easier now that he's settled in at 250 pounds, has that muscle, has that mass, and from a technical standpoint is in a much better place. I think that's really what I wanted to hammer home here. They think he could be an asset in the run game. And I think all the conversation we talked about with Luke Reynolds as a recruit, much of last year, was him as this vertical presence, 50-50 ball type guy. Go up and get it. Make highlight grabs like we saw. I think it was late against Kent State in a blowout last year. But this is a guy that I think can be on the field a bunch. Andrew Rapplier is going to try to have something to say about that as well. Dinkins will be out there. But I think he's going to accrue the kind of role for Andy Kotelnicki and the kind of importance to this offense that's going to make him a clear breakout player as the season goes on. And I do wonder, as he gets more comfortable, as Drew Aller starts to get a little more trust in his way, what does Andy Kotelnicki dial up specifically to tailor toward his skill set? Because Kotelnicki talks about putting your playmakers in the best spot to succeed. He's got a rare weapon here in Luke Reynolds, #1 tight end in the country last year. And I think that was for really good reasons as a recruit. And so how does that translate now that he's got his body in the right shape? I think it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. I think he's got bigger days ahead in 2026 and beyond, but it's going to be a fun breakout process for the tight end this year as a sophomore. And we go now to Mark, who's going to focus on defense with his answer.
Yeah, you lose Jalen Kimber. You need somebody to emerge opposite A.J. Harrison, who does that. Elliott Washington, competitor of the day, in all six winter workouts for the cornerbacks. Never happened before. James Franklin talked about how, this isn't Little League where everybody gets a trophy. They're going with the person who gets it done. And then by all accounts, he carried that through spring practice, summer, and then into fall camp. I mean, it's to the point now where I don't think it's even really a debate. I mean, I think coming out of last season, when we knew Kimber was going, I think most people are going to think that's going to be a real tight battle. This isn't a knock on the squirrel of Davian Collins. I mean, when they talk about the top cornerbacks, he's mentioned in there. But I think Washington has firmly established himself as a starter, and you're going to see a Davian be the key rotating guy in that group. So for him to emerge like that, I just thought was amazing. Interesting stat. I mean, did not have a ton of tackles last year. 1 interception, no returns, but he broke up 6 passes. And I don't have the snaps in front of me, Tyler, but I don't think he was like a gigantic snap type guy. So 6 passes, which was tops on the team. I don't know how they're rating these things, because it seems like some years they're rewarding breakups more than others. But he has a nose for the ball. And again, go back to what I said earlier about A.J. Harris. How many people will be avoiding him I think this is an opportunity for him to get a lot of opportunities to create turnovers. So Elliott Washington is my pick. Former high school sprinter. He's up to almost 200 pounds now. Very athletic, very aggressive, natural football instincts.
Probably the biggest horsepower number on the team is what we've heard in terms of Elliott Washington. And just to go back to the snap count, he was pretty high last year. He was at like 350 snaps. He was the next up behind those two starters on the perimeter, and Kimmer and Harris. But let's remember, he was nicked up toward the end of Big Ten play, missed a couple games, and that really gave opportunity to Davian Collins to play a bit more late in the season. And now it's kind of a three-man conversation. But yeah, Elliott Washington clearly has been on that breakout trajectory for a while. And what do you got for us on this one, Daniel?
Yeah, if we had done this exercise at 12:45 p.m. yesterday, I think Antoine Belgrave Shorter would have been the first one off the board.
Yeah.
But we did this a couple weeks ago, and I don't think any of us had that kind of foresight as high as we were on him.
Our next one is pretty good, though, guys. So just so you know,
it's a good tease, Mark. But yeah, I want Xavier Gilliam here. James Franklin mentioned last week that Gilliam is pushing Alonzo Ford for that starting job next to Zane Durant. This is someone that we heard really good things about over the course of last year. It didn't quite come together in the college football playoff for him to be a rotational guy. But talking to him in February, he sounded really determined to make things happen. And we've gotten really good feedback on him across the board pretty much since then. I think when you talk about defensive tackle, all the guys that they lost last year, Alonzo Ford coming back from injury, needing to get 5 or 6 deep, there's going to be a lot of opportunity there for Xavier Gilliam to play significant, meaningful snaps for Penn State. And I think he's going to do it. I think playing next to a guy like Zane Durant, you're going to have a chance to put up some numbers with all the attention that he's going to call for.
And we're going to 2 more things to get to here in our roundtable. Then we're going to bring you our season predictions. Let's start with our breakout player freshman category. So we're strictly talking about the guys who showed up to campus sometime between last winter and this summer. And Mark, you've got our first pick here. And I feel like this is steadily become a no-brainer at this point.
Yeah, it's kind of like some of the picks Daniel had where I'm going to go with defensive end Chas Coleman. When James Franklin said he was talking about a meeting where all the freshmen were there, and he was asking everybody, do you think you're, red light, yellow light, or green light? And for people who don't know, red light is, likely not playing this year, likely redshirting. Yellow light, kind of on the fence, you have an opportunity to play. Green light, you are definitely playing. And he asked Coleman, and he said he wasn't quite, he thought maybe he was a yellow. And Franklin said, everybody, quote, everybody in the room is kind of looking at him like, dude, you ain't yellow. And, you're looking at, I saw him down at the Hershey event. I think I may have mentioned this on a podcast. And this was right after he arrived. And, I think he was like 225, 230. He's almost up to 250 now, which is amazing. But he just had a length to him. And I went over to Franklin. I'm like, who is that kid? Because typically we know who these guys are. Like you've seen so much of them through the recruiting process. And I had seen him. I think he was visiting. I don't know if I saw him in camp, but and he just had a different, like this unbelievable length that we've seen out of guys like Etor and Denai. And I know those are pretty strong comments, but just physically, the length that this kid had. And the fact that he's putting it together and now is definitely a green light, I think it's huge for Penn State. You mentioned about the depth and inexperience at defensive end. Gilliam, obviously, out with a long-term injury. Plenty of time. Yeah, excuse me. Thanks for helping me out with that. But Zariah Fisher has been banged up throughout his career. So to have somebody step up like that is a good thing. Yeah, I'm putting Xavier Gilliam out with a long-term injury. I apologize, Xavier. Max Granville is the guy who's out with a long-term injury, but he was a guy who was projecting to play a lot. So to me, I think Chas Coleman, going to be fun to watch him develop over the next couple of years.
Coleman was one of 2 players officially getting that green light from James Franklin at the podium on Monday. And the other was, Daniel, your pick.
Darius Dixon, the top 100 cornerback from Southern California. I think I talked about this yesterday or on Monday's podcast when we were talking about the green lights, that when you look at this cornerback room, it's really easy to just kind of say like, oh, like I don't see snaps there when you talk about Harris, Collins, and Washington. But those guys are going to get rotated out. Penn State is going to have different points in the game where they're up big, and it's time to get younger guys in. And by all accounts, it seems like Darius Dixon is going to be that next guy up on the outside behind those three. So I think that we can see him play plenty of snaps. We know that if you can play, Terry Smith isn't afraid to put you out there in a key situation. I always think about Kalen King as a freshman in November 2021 being out there against Michigan and being involved in the in that long touchdown that won the game for the Wolverines. Like, Terry Smith will put you out there. And the feedback we've gotten on Darius Dixon from James Franklin and Jim Knowles on down has all been very positive. So I think Dixon is going to get the chance to make some plays this year. I think one thing, reading between the lines a little bit, with James Franklin talking about needing to see these freshmen embrace special teams a little bit more, I kind of interpreted that as Dixon being someone who has embraced that, and which is a big reason why he has that green light. Another avenue for him to make some plays. So I think we're going to see plenty of Darius Dixon this fall.
You guys may remember opening day or media day for preseason camp. We had Justin Lustig, special teams coordinator, up, and I asked him, hey, any freshmen, carving their path toward playing time through special teams? Only named one name. It was Darius Dixon, and that was on the third day of preseason camp. So
I guess I didn't need to read between the lines then.
But yeah, you're right, and that kind of sets the stage for my pick here. I'm going Kobe Howard at receiver. I think really you probably focus on two guys here for the third pick. Kobe Howard, and then Ivan Kamaju, who we've heard really good things about going back to last winter at defensive end. James Franklin says they're basically going to approach these first few games as though he's going to play the whole season, but they haven't given him that official green light just yet to join Chaz Coleman in defensive end. Kobe Howard's where I land because I just think that we've heard way too much about this guy on the practice field from veterans, from coaches, for it not to show up at some point here on Saturdays. And I'm thinking it's going to show up earlier than later in non-conference play, perhaps this Saturday. James Franklin said the reason that Kobe Howard isn't an all-the-way green light right now is because they want to see him carve out more of a role on special teams, show that he belongs there. So I'd imagine that James Franklin didn't just put that out in a public setting for his own pleasure. I think he understands that's going to get back around to Kobe Howard. And I think Kobe Howard will probably take care of that. He's a guy that is angry. He is a guy that has a chip on his shoulder, not generally, but to play. He is a guy who is angry on the field because he thinks he needs to be playing a key role. I mean, we've heard Marcus Higgins describe it a bunch of times, go on a concrete surface in the parking lot, roll out a football, who's picking that football up and saying, let's play tackle. He says Kobe Howard is that dude. And so Kobe Howard to me isn't a lot like the freshman receivers we've discussed in the past, where perhaps there was some timidness to them. Doesn't sound like there's anything timid about this guy going up against defenders, fitting in the offensive plan. And I just get a sense that, again, Andy Kotelnicki, if you're trying to maximize your offensive personnel, if this is a kid who's going to bring something special to your offense, you find a way to fit him in 10 to 15 snaps a game and work off of that. I don't know how much Trevor Pena, Kyron Hudson, maybe Devontae Ross are going to leave the field, but you talk about Liam Clifford and Tyseer Denmark and Kobe Howard being kind of those next three up and part of that six. I think it's a good starting point to hear James Franklin firmly say Kobe Howard is a two-deep player entering the season, because if I'm remembering correctly, the last time we heard any freshman described that way at this position was 5 years ago, and that was Parker Washington and Keandre Lambert-Smith. So I'm going to hang my hat on, although he's not a burned green light guy quite yet, he's going to get there, and when we get into Big Ten action, he could have a bit of a piece of the pie in this passing game. So I'm going with Kobe Howard. And
Tyler, Franklin basically said he's a green light, though, right? I mean, you touched on that, but I think he's just, like you said, pushing motivational buttons. I think that it's fair. And I just think these were done, everybody, long before yesterday's press conference. Yes. So we weren't, spot on all these, but for the freshmen, I think we had a pretty good feel for who was going to emerge.
Yeah, it feels like this has been, especially with Chaz Coleman's quick ascension. Remember, it was like day 3 of practice when we put together that preseason report on him just turning heads. So it's felt like really throughout the month of August that these were the 4 freshmen in focus. And as I mentioned on our last podcast, a guy like Tyke Hayes at running back, a guy like Alex Tash at linebacker, how do those positional competitions work out? do injuries impact the opportunity for them to go out on the football field? There are other freshmen to know, but it feels like these have been the four at the forefront of the conversation. We've got three on our list here for the Roundtable Series, and we're going to wrap up on a different subject now, and that's going to be potential trap game. So we're not talking about Oregon whiteout game late September. We're not talking about November 1st in Columbus against Ohio State. Those games aren't going to surprise anybody. But trap game on this 2025 schedule, however you might interpret it, that was what we were asked to pick here. Daniel, you lead us off.
Yeah, I think Penn State's schedule sets up very nicely this year. When you talk about having the bye weeks before Oregon and Ohio State, that eliminates that look ahead potential that we like to talk about so much. And then the letdown spots after those games don't really strike me as really big letdowns. I think after you play Oregon, you're going to go across the country to sunny Southern California to play UCLA. I think that's the type of game that can keep your interest as a team. And then after Ohio State, you come home and you play Indiana. And who knows where Indiana will be by the time you get to November, but there's a chance that that's a top 20 team coming into Beaver Stadium for that game. So that'll have your attention. So those are the logical places to look for these games. But I settled on October 11th against Northwestern at home. I think it falls into a potentially tricky pocket of the schedule where you're home against Oregon, at UCLA, you come back to State College, you don't take the bye week after the West Coast trip like you did against USC, and then you play Northwestern. But then on the other end, you have that trip to Iowa. And I think that is something that is going to have Penn State's attention. The Iowa guys at Big Ten Media Days were talking about that game and how much they remembered it. We know that from that 2023 game when Iowa came to Beaver Stadium, we know that people in Penn State remembered that game, even if they weren't on the roster at that point back in 2021. So I think that this Northwestern game is in that pocket where you're going to have a game against a physical Oregon team, go across the country to play UCLA, come back, and then you're going to have a game against Iowa looming there. I think that this fits that in that structure where maybe some wires could get crossed, maybe some younger guys get that introduction into what the grind of big time college football is like. And I think that this is a point in the season where maybe you see like a slow start. Northwestern's played Penn State tough the past couple of years, especially in the first half. Maybe this is like a 17-10, 13-10 game at the half, and you're like, what's going on here? But yeah, I went with Northwestern, even though it is homecoming.
Yeah, you guys remember that sloppy Northwestern matchup in 2022 when I think Singleton and everybody was fumbling the ball a bunch of times. It was ugly. They won pretty comfortably, I think, but I mean, it was one of those games. It was like, are they ever going to?
It was 17-7.
17-7, so it wasn't as comfortable. It was like a game where you never felt like Northwestern was going to win it, but it was like, is Penn State going to keep playing with their food here? And so, yeah, interesting way to start off the conversation. I think we'll get more intel on that Iowa game in just a moment, just to tease things a bit. But I'm going further down the calendar. I'm going to a destination where James Franklin is 1-3 as Penn State's head coach. And when you get into mid-November, I don't know what East Lansing is going to look like. I've been up to East Lansing, and when I think of East Lansing, maybe you agree with me, Mark. I think gray. I think squishy mud underneath my feet. And so, a couple of years ago, it was a snow game to finish off the regular season. So I think the weather throws enough curveballs potentially to kind of add another layer to this trap game. As I mentioned, this hasn't been the best series for Penn State on the road under James Franklin. 3 losses, one win. And ultimately, I think Michigan State's in a spot where you want to see what they have now that their coaching regime's in year 2. Do they take a step forward? Are they going to remind people that they can be a potential power team in the Big Ten? Not a few years removed from them being right in the mix there for the conference championship. They've made the playoff in years past. So I wouldn't put it past Michigan State having a bit of a resurgence this year, taking a couple strides forward and being maybe a tougher task than as they might appear right now in late August. So the weather combination, I think the team's going to be better than they were last year. And beyond that, you're going to be kind of at your portion of the schedule for Penn State where it's going to be a little bit easier to start focusing on the finish line and the college football playoff, because by that point, you're coming off of back-to-back matchups against Ohio State and Indiana. So you've got those two squads that were in the playoff last year. You're done with bye weeks, and then you go to Michigan State. And I just wonder if, again, that human nature aspect, if you roll through and say you're unbeaten and you already finally beat Ohio State and you took care of pesky Indiana, do you have the energy to go get it done in East Lansing, or can you put full 4 quarters out there? So that's where I landed with mine. And Mark, as I said, we're going back to Iowa City.
I'm stunned Iowa was still here at 3. I mean, ESPN win probability for Penn State is 75.5. That's third lowest for Penn State in a game behind Ohio State. Penn State's underwater there in Oregon. Penn State 2-1 in its last 3 trips. The average score 19.3 to 18.0. Penn State just doesn't score a lot of points out there. So I just that is a tough place to play. They're known for knocking off top opponents. Number 2, Michigan crushed Iowa 26 to nothing in 2023, but Penn State fell there, as you mentioned, in 2021. And number 6, Ohio State, was crushed 55-24 in 17. So it's a great atmosphere, great fans. They are going to be hyped up. If Penn State is ranked number 2 or number 1 or whatever, they are going to be ready. So to me, that is the ultimate trap game. Yes, before a bye week, but I could still see people looking ahead to Ohio State. So to me, it's Iowa all the way.
All right, fun conversation for this roundtable. Thanks for putting together the topics, Mark, and a lot of fun over at the site as well. We've had a lot of engagement with our readers and audience over at Lions247.com as they've given us our picks as well. If you want to do that, head over to the site. Let us know what you think about these roundtables. And let's finish now and put it on the line. Our regular season predictions. We'll come back to you later in the week with our Game 1 predictions for Nevada. Spoiler alert, I think we're going to go 3 for 3 in picking Penn State to come out 1-0. But big picture, 12-game schedule. Let's see what we got. Mark, we'll begin with you.
Yeah, I know a lot of people have said this, but it's because it's true. You know, I'm going to believe Penn State could beat Ohio State, especially in Columbus, after I see it happening. I mean, James Franklin has just had his hands full. The staff has had its hands full. These players have had their hands full. So I'm going 11-1. I like the schedule overall. Not nearly as many frequent flyer miles as last year. You know, the long trips, you know, UCLA, I think will be manageable for them. Iowa, and then the rest of them are really relatively short trips. Obviously a bye week before Oregon. I don't think Oregon knows what it's walking into. We had a chance to talk to some of the Oregon players out of Big Ten Media Days. I don't know what I expected them to say, but they didn't seem as if they were really impressed by they were really nervous about playing in a whiteout. But I have seen a lot of teams come from the West Coast and try to play Penn State at Beaver Stadium early in the season, and it hasn't really gone very well. So I think it's going to be a whole different atmosphere for Oregon. I think Penn State's going to manage the rest of the schedule, but Penn State has, I think, equal, if not more, overall talent, veteran talent, I should say, than Ohio State. But I have to see it to believe it. So I'm going at 11-1 regular season. Still going to be a high seed in the college football playoff, but I'll believe it when I see it.
And that would be stacking up back-to-back 11-win campaigns for James Franklin after he didn't get to that point in any of his first 11 regular seasons with the Nittany Lions. Daniel, why don't you follow up Mark?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as Mark. I know that there's a line of thinking that just because someone hasn't done something doesn't mean that they can't do it. And that's, but for me, I think I still fall on I need to see it when it comes to Penn State beating Ohio State. I went back through, I picked Penn State to win that game each of the past 2 years. And I think after they lost last year, I said, I'm done. Like I'm not picking Penn State to beat Ohio State until they actually do it. So, you know, that came through in my predictions. I have them 11-1. I think the schedule sets up nicely, just as I kind of ran down when talking about the potential trap game. The one thing about Penn State that has really, I think, held over these past 3 years is that they don't lose the teams that they're not supposed to anymore. And I think that that's the mark of a very healthy program. And you look at the game and or you look at the schedule and you're supposed to win all these games outside of maybe Ohio State. I think that the Oregon game will be intriguing. Personally, I don't think they're going to be fazed by that atmosphere. You know, they play in big time environments at Autzen. Hearing the Ohio State players talk about Autzen at Big Ten Media Days. It seemed like that was something that they weren't ready for when they got out there. But I think that where Oregon is, new quarterback, a lot of different guys to replace from that team that went 13-0 last year, got that number 1 seed in the playoff. I think that game falls at a really nice time for Penn State. So, yeah, I think we'll get to the end of November. Penn State will be 11-1, and we'll be figuring out how to get out to Indianapolis on well, hopefully it won't be as short notice this time, but we'll be making that trip a little bit west.
Sure seems like a good indication of where Penn State has progressed as a program. That it feels like across the beat, guys, the baseline is 10 wins. Like you're just starting with that 10 wins and working from there because they have earned the benefit of the doubt. There's been some tricky moments. I think about that matchup at Minnesota last year. They pulled it out by the skin of their teeth. I expect to be, a game or two, perhaps that is in that kind of territory this year. But
USC too.
Yeah, USC, of course, that was a nail biter. Didn't 60 minutes of football wasn't enough to settle that thing. But I think ultimately when we get to the conversation, it really comes down to Oregon and Ohio State, as you guys have addressed. When it comes to the Ducks, last I checked, they're about a 5-point underdog projected for that matchup in late September. I don't know how much they're going to figure out about some of the really important new pieces. Daniel referenced they've got a new quarterback. They're missing their top receiver with an injury, defensive pieces to replace. Not the same roster retention experience that Penn State had over the course of this offseason. I think Penn State's going to clear that 5-point margin. I could see them even doubling that in a primetime whiteout setting. So that, lands on the November 1st matchup in Columbus. And like you, Daniel, I'm not sure if you did, Mark. Did you pick Ohio State or Penn State to beat Ohio State each of the last 2 years, Mark?
I don't know. I'll have to go back and look.
I think we all may have picked them to win in Columbus in 23, picked them to win in Beaver Stadium in 24.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I was wrong. You were wrong. But I don't know if you guys can see. I might have just a little bit of blue Kool-Aid up of my lip here because over the course of these several months, I have gone from being like, nah, I'm going to hold out. 11-1 is where I'm going. Got to see it to believe it. The exact same things you've said. Now I'm going 12-0, boys. I'm going 12-0. I'm taking the plunge. And after much deliberation, it really hinges on a few things why I'm willing to go and say for a third straight year that they're going to beat Ohio State. Banking on that improved offensive balance. I think last year it was a little bit of wish casting from Penn State fans that all of a sudden a receiver was going to have a big game against Ohio State. It was the flip side of that. Receivers cost them dearly against Ohio State and allowed the Buckeyes to do some things against Tyler Warren with Caleb Downs that really spelled disaster for their offense. They didn't get to the end zone. I think the balance is going to be in a better place this year with the receiver upgrades, where their run game is, where the offensive line is. I like their chances to punch it into the goal line if they got 4 tries, from the doorstep this time around because of their personnel. And look, Jim Knowles brand swap. They didn't go and get him for no reason. They didn't make him the highest paid coordinator in college football for no reason. Say what you will about Ohio State staff and what kind of mixed feelings there might have been with the exit, but he was an integral part of them building an elite defense, getting to the national championship, and winning the trophy last year. And I just generally have to pick up on what we have been experiencing at Penn State. I know the vibes argument is a terrible one. It doesn't hold much water. But look, we're face-to-face with these dudes all year long. You've covered them long enough. Mark, you certainly have. It's just a different conversation. Yeah. They're looking you in the eye and telling you they intend to play for a national championship. If you had this conversation a couple of years ago, guys would look at the floor and say, 1-0, Nevada, 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 Nevada. So I'm leaning into that a little bit as picking up some of the local pulse, but it's more about Jim Knowles, what that brand swap can mean, and the fact that they should have more reliable offensive attack when it comes to balancing that rush and the pass. And so I'll go 12-0. We'll revisit this when we get to late October and see where we all stand on Ohio State and if Penn State can clear all the other hurdles. But it shapes up as the biggest matchup on the schedule yet again, guys. And anything else to add before we wrap up what has been hopefully a really fun episode for those who've listened or watched?
One of us picked Ohio State last year.
It was you.
Okay. Savvy vet.
Yeah. Here we go. You had 27-24 Ohio State. And, of course, that was a game Penn State jumped out 10-0. But let's not sully this great episode by rehashing the 2024 Penn State-Ohio State matchup.
We'll end it on that note. Get Tyler Warren the ball.
All 3 of us will be back on the Penn State practice field Wednesday afternoon into the evening. We'll have 2 practice notebooks up, one on offense, one on defense. Mark Brennan will have video highlights put together from both sides of the ball. Grace Brennan will have a full photo gallery up for you. And we'll hear from James Franklin, a variety of coaches, a variety of players, as the fine-tuning is just about over with Nevada coming to town for a Saturday afternoon kickoff. We're back with you for another episode this week to preview the matchup specifically. We'll give you our score predictions. We'll also have a Nevada beat reporter on to break down the Wolfpack's strengths and weaknesses coming in as a 6-touchdown underdog. Guys, it's been a lot of fun. I think our offseason's just about over. We're switching into a different gear at Lions247.com, but it's been a pleasure. And so let's see what this team can do now. On behalf of Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.